Seguir a segunda palestra especial do 19º Fórum da Liberdade, que aborda o tema Os líderes e o Estado de que precisamos. Compõe a mesa principal o senhor Hernando de Soto, palestrante e convidado, e a senhora Ana Amélia Lemos, mediadora do 19º Fórum da Liberdade. Inicialmente, o senhor Paulo Wibel, vice-presidente do Instituto de Estudos Empresariais, fará uma breve apresentação do tema proposto para esta palestra, bem como apresentará o nosso próximo palestrante.
Boa tarde, senhoras e senhores. Em nome do Instituto de Estudos Empresariais, eu gostaria de agradecer mais uma vez a presença de todos nesta palestra especial. É com muita honra e satisfação que apresento o nosso palestrante, senhor Hernando de Soto. Praticamente todos vocês conhecem o nosso próximo palestrante. Entretanto, algumas pessoas não conhecem a real dimensão e a verdadeira importância do senhor Hernando de Soto no cenário mundial. Seus trabalhos, como Um Outro Sendeiro e o Mistério do Capital, ecoaram no mundo inteiro, sendo que este último, inclusive, foi traduzido para mais de 20 idiomas. Suas obras mostram claramente a importância da propriedade privada e os malefícios que a informalidade pode trazer para uma sociedade. Tamanha foi a repercussão dessas palavras e desses ensinamentos que o senhor Hernando de Soto foi alvo de inúmeros atentados, inúmeras pessoas que tentaram calar a sua voz e os seus ensinamentos. Felizmente, sua bravura e a lealdade às suas ideias fizeram com que ele permanecesse íntegro, ativo e defendendo-as em todo o mundo. Assim, o fundador do Instituto Liberdade e Democracia está aqui com a gente nesta tarde para passar um pouco esses ensinamentos e para fazer com que o amanhã no nosso Brasil seja um pouco diferente. Obrigado mais uma vez, senhor Hernando de Soto, e tenha a palavra.
E para a condução dos trabalhos, nós passamos de imediato a palavra à mediadora, a jornalista Ana Amélia Lemos.
Estou muito feliz porque nessa mediação há uma estrela especial fazendo esta palestra aos senhores nesta tarde. E eu passo, então, neste momento, a palavra ao nosso conferencista que veio especialmente para este compromisso, Hernando de Soto.
Thank you very much all for being here. I'm delighted to be in Porto Alegre with you. And I will get right down to the subject, which I think brings everyone to this forum, which is a certain disappointment that many of us who, when seeing the collapse of communism in 1989 and the early reforms of Deng Xiaoping in China earlier on in the 70s, felt that the world was moving towards a different type of organization. My friend Francis Fukuyama, as you know, wrote a book called The End of History, the purpose of which was to herald a new era, a new time. But in fact, since the 90s, more than 15 years have passed, and though there have been enormous steps ahead in Eastern Europe, there has obviously been the collapse of communism and many dictatorships. All is not well in most parts of the world. I don't have to give you the details of the numbers of conflicts that there are in Africa, radicalisms that are arising again in Latin America, revolts that occur even in China today. Last year, the government recognized that there were 85,000 revolts only in that country. And the question then arises, and I think it's a very good one of the forum, which is to ask, why haven't we been able to meet expectations? I mean, we've reduced deficits all over the world, we've privatized, we've deregulated, and this forum was convened to try and rethink what had to be done. I gather from the summaries given to me before coming to Brazil that there were essentially three questions that were being asked. One of them was the cultural traditions. What can we do about changing certain cultural traditions in our countries that possibly are in the way of progress? The second one is, do we have the adequate policies? Are we formulating the guidelines correctly. And the third is, do we need a new kind of leadership, considering all the insatisfactions there are with existing leaderships nearly all over our continent and, of course, in many other parts of the world. I will deal with these each separately, and beginning with the cultural traditions. The first thing that we have to say about culture is that this is something that nobody talks about very much, but is in everybody's mind and in very small conversations. And it goes back to the old tradition, even of David Hume, asking if civilization, or modern society as it was even known 300 years ago, was really for all cultures and all ethnic groups in the world. As you know, Max Weber, the German philosopher, didn't believe so. He believed that it had to do very much with a Protestant ethic. It had to do with Anglo-Saxons. It had to do with Germans. And recently, we have the same reaction in American intellectuals like Samuel Huntington, who vis-a-vis both the Arabs and vis-a-vis the Mexicans, definitely believes that not all of us are fit for a free society, a market economy. Others require more authority. And as you know, there are leaders in Latin America who agree totally with Max Weber and Huntington and say that we are a cultural set apart. The basic argument that the North Americans and the European intellectuals who believe that we are not culturally prepared in Latin America or elsewhere in the third world for moving towards a market economy, as is known in Western Europe and the United States, Canada, the North Atlantic countries, is because whatever you're going to do in a market economy, you're going to require trust. You have to trust each other. Whether you're going to work in the open market, whether you're going to do the division of labor within an enterprise, or whether you're going to be able to accumulate capital, you cannot do this alone. There's nothing in this room that has been done by one person. Everything requires cooperation. And cooperation, if it is done outside a vertical system of authority, requires the capacity to trust your interlocutors. And of course, we are told that we do not have this capacity to trust that the Anglo-Saxons do. And to make the news even worse, recently, the University of Michigan has done a worldwide study on behavioral patterns in different parts of the world, and to establish how many people trust other people. So let me give you the results. When asked in Norway, on a sizable sample, how many Norwegians trusted other Norwegians, 65% of Norwegians said they trusted other people. When it went to Sweden and other Scandinavian countries or Nordic countries, the figure came down to 60%, but 60% of people who trust is already a sizable amount. And when it came to countries of Middle Europe, like Germany, or developed countries of Asia, like Japan, it was around 45%. But when it came to my country, Peru, the amount of people who trusted each other was 5%. And I'm sorry to say that Brazil was 3%. So we are in a miserable quality. And one of the reasons, of course, that I like to travel abroad is because I don't like talking in Peru, because nobody believes me. And I was not particularly happy to come to Brazil because from the figures I saw, even less of you would believe me.
It's not true. So
I was really delighted last week because I was called into the United States, and I immediately said, these are people who trust you. What a homely, friendly feeling. So when I walked into immigrations at the Washington Dulles Airport, and it was my turn to go towards the migrations, I looked in the sky blue eyes of the Anglo-Saxon, who asked me for my identity, and I said, I'm so glad to see you. I will identify myself. I am the son of Alberto Soto de la Jara and Rosa Polar. They come from Spain about 380 years ago. Actually, my mother actually came from the Ticino, that's the Italian part of Italy. But they both came as military to settle Peru, and he said, stop, just show me your passport. And when I showed the gringo my passport, he began trusting me. So I remembered at that moment that Bertrand Russell had always said that there are two ways of acquiring knowledge. One is knowledge by acquaintance, which is the way I have had the pleasure of meeting you and meeting other friends of this institute and organizers of this forum. And then there's knowledge by description. A passport is knowledge by description. Most of the things you actually know, you know by description. Most of you have not been to Kazakhstan, but you know that Kazakhstan exists by description. Most of you are not survivors of the Roman Empire, but you know by description that the Roman Empire does exist. And therefore, if you really think about it, the majority of people that you actually know, it doesn't exceed about 3,000 people. The other day, my secretary changed my pilot and told me, you know, the memory will not take more than 2,500. You've got to change your address list, which I did. I took it on an airplane, unwritten, and just crossed out the names that I remembered, and I didn't get over 2,500. So we may all be brothers and sisters in this world, but if you want to work in a market, and if you want to work in a national market, and if you want to work in a global market, there is no way that among 6 billion people we can identify each other. You actually need the product of documents. And it is the documents that will actually allow you to identify yourself. My friends identify because of their eyebrows, their eyes, their smile, their gait, the clothes. But on a global scale, on a national scale, even on a state scale, you need that kind of determination of who you are, because that's a question that's being asked. And then the question comes along, how many people in this world can identify themselves in such a way that they can participate in a market economy? Now, you need 3 things, for example, if you're going to export to Argentina within the Mercosur, or maybe one day we Peruvians will export with a free trade area, Tratado de Libre Comercio with the United States, or any part of the world. You have to fill in a bill of lading, un conocimiento de embarque. It's the passport of a good. It's the passport of any transfer of value. And you have to put in your name officially, you've got to put in your address officially, and you've got to say where you work and what your enterprise is officially. And our calculation is that in Peru, approximately only 25% of Peruvians can fill in those 3 lines. Now, we thought that was, of course, a very Peruvian problem until we began working for President Fox in Mexico, and we have found out that they're also 20 to 25%. So a first thing that I will give against the cultural argument is simply that the identification systems and what is necessary to identify people in our parts of the world are not really working. And before we ask about culture, we should ask about identity, which therefore leads me to the second point. Since I mentioned that identity required property, I would like to talk about the importance of property because it is much more than ownership. I have brought, for example, to this conference an apple. This here is my apple, and I have some very outstanding members of the institute that organized this forum and worthwhile, honest members of the hotel that will certify that I bought this apple and that this apple is mine. But no matter how you look at this apple, there is nothing in this apple that says this is Hernando's apple. Because whether it's Hernando's apple or it's a stolen apple, they all look the same. Stolen apples and legitimate apples are all the same. There's nothing in this apple either that says whether I own it, whether I can sell it, whether I can buy it, whether I can loan it, whether I can lease it, whether I can transfer it, whether I can rent it, whether I can pledge it, whether I can mortgage it, whether I can use it at a point of collection or fix a rate. Nothing in this apple tells me anything that I can do commercially with an apple or that I can do in terms of relationships to other people. My passport does. So that means that there are really 2 different sorts of things in the world. There are physical things, and physical things have always been traded. Jesus Christ threw the markets out of the temple because they had converted the temple into a market, and he obviously didn't like it. But that market was a micro market, and micro markets were not capable of creating wealth either in Senegal or in Palestine 2,000, 3,000 years ago. What created wealth was larger markets where you could have division of labor on a broader scale. So a market economy doesn't work with physical goods alone. A market economy works with documents. If you go to the markets of cacao, if you go abroad, if you go to the London Metal Exchange, wherever you go, people are not trading physical goods in the developed world, they're trading representations of goods. And representations are much more efficient because they tell you a variety of things about the goods. Who owns it, on what conditions it can be transferred, what obligations, what rights are in place. Those things would be practically and are absolutely impossible without some kind of documentation. But they do much more than that. I had the privilege lately of having been invited by the chairman, or the former chairman of the Federal Reserve of the United States, Mr. Alan Greenspan, who invited me because I wrote a book on capital, and he said that this was right on. And so I was, of course, extremely honored because he's a very famous and obviously a very thorough economist. And I said, you know, that at one moment or other I may be coming to Brazil, and I had some very simple questions to him that I would have liked to be able to repeat to you with certain discretion. So I asked him the following question. I said, Mr. Greenspan, how do you know how much money to put into the market? How do you know how much money to make available for credit? And he said, well, you named it, the market. In other words, I try and see how many people own things and make transactions in the market. And I said, is it true that you use the Central Intelligence Agency for this purpose? Because I understand they have very good data collecting abilities. And he said, no, we do not use the CIA for that. We have no police whatsoever. What we use are the markets. So I said, that means that what you do is you have some kind of observers outside all of the factories, and you see how many automobiles are coming out, how many easy chairs are coming out, how many headphones are coming out, how many suits are coming out, and you calculate and put the amount of money. He says, no, I don't do that. Because in this country, everything that is owned is paperized and recorded. And every transaction, at least the great majority of them, are on records and travel through legal documents. And that allows me to know how much money and how much credit. I said, now imagine that you came from a country such as mine, or like Egypt, or like Mexico, where actually we think that less than 30% of transactions and of course of goods are recorded. How would you know how much money to put inside and how much credit to give? And he said, I don't think I would know how to do that. So the reply is that if you don't have property, it's not only that ownership isn't protected, it's also that you don't have money on the quantity and quality you want, and you don't have credit, because credit essentially comes from the Latin word called credere, which is all about credibility, which is essentially, I believe in you if you have something to lose. Because we human beings are extremely imaginative, but we're also big liars. And if there is no way to paperize anything that is affirmed, there is no way to create a good economic base. How can you be able to form capital if you do not have shares? The majority of firms that we have in Latin America actually cannot issue shares. So how can you capture investment? Have you ever seen a capital investment that isn't put in a property document? And the reply will probably no or very little. So if you do not have property, you don't have credit, you don't have good money, but you also don't have electricity and you don't have clean water, at least proportioned on a basis that can be reimbursable. How would you be able, if you're an electrical company moving into favelas or moving into the hinterland of your own country, be able to identify subscribers, create utility subscription contracts, establish service connections, ensure access to parcels and buildings? How would you be able to implement billing systems, meter reading systems, collection mechanisms, loss and control of delinquent procedures, fraud control, and enforcement services if you didn't know where precisely everybody lived? And that happens to be the situation in most of our countries. Therefore, a second item that I will mention apart from identity is that the markets don't work in our country because the property systems don't work. And without property systems, there are no identity of objects, there's no identity of transactions, and that leads also to the problem of liquidity. The next thing that I'd like to point out has to do with enterprises. How do you, in effect, create enterprises? Now, I will give you a case because I have nowhere else to go, and I don't know Brazil, and even if I knew Brazil in the books, I probably wouldn't get a reply. About 1850, in the United States, a man called Dudley Smith in New York made a very revolutionary act. And that revolutionary act consisted of allowing everybody by law to be able to create an enterprise. Now, before that, you needed an act of Congress. That's 150 years ago. You needed an act of Congress if you wanted to form an enterprise in the United States. And before that, in most European countries, you needed a special charter from the king. Otherwise, you couldn't. So the democratization of enterprise, that anybody could have access to the tools that make it, is only a very recent victory. And the question would be, how many people have access to one? But not one that has no teeth, one that has teeth. For example, one that creates an absolutely separate space from the family space. If you go to Peru, in most enterprises that you have, which we're very proud of course, because they are manifestations of entrepreneurship, and you go to a micro enterprise and you say, who's the boss? Usually a man with a big mustache, a few gold teeth comes out and says, I'm the boss. But as you talk to him to make a deal, you look at his wife and you really wonder, because of the suspicious way she looks at you, if she's not the boss. You don't really know. And if you look at the mother-in-law, she's probably really the boss of them all. If you go to a constituted enterprise that has created a separate hierarchy, you know who's the CEO, you know who's the COO, you know who's in charge of production, you know who's in charge of sales. You are able to identify people, and you're able to then make them accountable, and the division of labor takes place. And though the company may be family-owned, the hierarchy in the company is very different from the hierarchy that there is in the family. So families and businesses have actually meant that not only do we have tribes, not only do we have political parties to identify ourselves with, not only do we have ethnic ways to identify ourselves or identify ourselves by our hobbies, and we have also the possibility of nationalities, we also have enterprises. And the fact that the West had a special regime for enterprises actually meant, of course, that it had the possibility to divide labor within the enterprise, which both according to Marx and to Adam Smith was the reason why Europe started developing from the 18th to the 19th century in an extraordinary way, which it had not before. But they don't only have that. An enterprise has limited liability, which means that the law can clearly specify that you owe nothing more than what you have actually risked. But that's because you also have a system of shares, which is a system of property rights. You have asset partitioning, which means that you can pool all the resources together, not materially, but in liquid form, and represent them here instead of having to accumulate rotten apples. It also means you have perpetual succession, which means that when somebody dies, not only the physical objects get transferred, but the whole human capital of putting together an enterprise can go through generation and generation. It's immortality in business. You couldn't possibly have that without the law. And you have standards which you can converse with each company. Now, in the study that we just handed to President Fox, which has been already presented in public, so I have the right to speak about it, we asked how many of Mexico's enterprises have actually got the capacity to put out shares, have associates, perpetual succession, limited liability, asset partitioning, and all the organization tools that allow you to divide labor, that allow you to delegate labor, and that allow you to organize yourself efficiently. Of all of Mexico's enterprises, only 6% have the right to do that. And in the case of Tanzania, where we've just figured, it's only 1%. And in the case of Peru, it's in the order of 8%. We give them, of course, the poor people, a series of vehicles to organize themselves, but none with the teeth. So it isn't a question of saying, are you legal or are you not legal? But do you have the instruments to recognize yourself in the market, to assess risk, to raise capital, and to raise credit? If you don't, you cannot work in the market. And the question then would be, how many people in Brazil, I don't know, but you have to count it, because there are no World Bank books on this. There are no national statistics. How many people organized for business in Brazil can do all the things I talked about, which an American firm, a Canadian firm, and a German firm can do? What I'm basically trying to bring forward to you is the following thing, that the market economy has ended up being a much more complicated phenomenon than we expected. And it requires an invisible infrastructure. As a matter of fact, that's what Adam Smith called it. Adam Smith said that you needed an invisible hand. As a matter of fact, even Carl Jung talked about the fact that there was a collective subconscious. Practically every philosopher, even Michel Foucault, says that all thought is organized at a stratum that is abstract, that is called the episteme, where all knowledge is organized. And what I'm trying to tell you is, if that infrastructure, which is essentially a metaphysical infrastructure, which Marx also talked about, is not in place, then it won't work. And it has manifestations which are essentially documents. And therefore, what I'm trying to tell you is that it's not culture that is against the market, because all people are in the market. At least we won't be able to determine until we find out. Essentially, the invisible hand is the law. And if the law isn't in place, and the law does not create identity, and the law does not give you tools with which to trade and to organize labor, and does not give you property rights with which to identify yourself and identify the things that you have to lose for, you'll have to lose so as to obtain credit, you cannot make markets. And the question then would be, how many people actually are able to have that? Now, one of the reasons I'm confident that we do is because, among other things, I understand you have a very similar phenomenon to us in Peru, which is that in the 1930s and the 1940s, about 1 million Japanese families migrated to Brazil and Peru. So the Fujimoris came to Peru, the Nishiyamas came to Brazil. Now, the question is, why did they come here? Why didn't the Toledos and the Lulas go to Japan? And the reply to that is because we were richer then than Japan, Formosa, which is today Taiwan, and South Korea. As a matter of fact, between Brazil and Peru at that time, we were closer together in terms of growth. Our GNP per capita was 2.5 times higher than Japan's, and 3 times higher than South Korea's or Taiwan, which were the colonies of Japan. Now, Fujimori, as you know, is now in jail in Chile, but before he was residing in Japan for 5 years, and he went to a country that is now 10 times richer than Peru. And the question is, what happened? Didn't they have a different feudal culture when they came to our countries as poor people, gardeners, workers? And the reply is yes. But when they decided to change in 1945 and up to 1952, and because of the shock of the war, they created a system where the property rights were in place, where access to business was in place, where identity got put into place, where democratic institutions that kept governments in contact with the people at every moment, called shingikais and kochokais and press clubs, are all in place so that there is no divorce between government, or at least as possible, and between the people. You know, even the Americans were in that thing. I just read a very interesting and moving speech of Abraham Lincoln, who advanced to St. Louis in a buggy and horse in 1832, when he was still a congressman. And he writes, and it's part of his speech to the people of St. Louis, how absolutely grieved he is, because as he rode into St. Louis, 1832, he was not able to see the sunset because of the amount of corpses hanging from the boughs of trees, like curtains, he said, which did not allow people to look at the sun set. And the reason they were dead and they'd been hung is because of property conflicts and business conflicts and identity conflicts, of course. Who are you? And if I don't know you, I'll shoot you. So all developed countries have gone through great violence. All developed countries have been informal. And the question, of course, then is, why can't we change? But that's then another matter which leads to leadership, which is now the third question that I'm going to address. Do you need leadership to effect good changes? And the reply is absolutely yes. I have never seen anywhere in history, and I don't pretend to be a great historian. As a matter of fact, I'm not even a historian, a great observer of history, and have seen anything take place without leadership. Whether it was in the United States, people like Jefferson and Hamilton actually brought down the British system of privileged access to property and business. And as a matter of fact, they put out 32 preemption acts all throughout the 19th century, which ended up with the Homesteading Act, and made sure that property wasn't only of benefit to the rich, but was of benefit to everybody on their continent. Even the California gold rush began about 1848, and by 1856 in California there were about 800 home mine claims, and there were 800 systems of law. And the United States spent the rest of the 50 years bringing all their favelas and all their centerras together under a rule of law where they could all understand each other and where there would not be any alienation or division of classes, so that they could bring their country together. The Germans did the same thing. In 1806, when Napoleon defeated them, the first thing the Kaiser did, realizing that finally the rebellion of the farmers was getting into a situation of danger, he created the Stein-Hardenberg Commissions, and over 100 years they created the Grünbuch system and made sure that the law was democratic and of equal access to everybody in the country. And Switzerland used to be the poorest country in Western Europe until the beginning of the 20th century. I mean, so poor that you still have the Swiss Guard of the Pope. They were mercenaries. They had to go out and rent their young people and throw their lives away because they had not enough money. But in 1908, they put out the Civil Code of Switzerland and brought in enterprise and brought in democratic institutions and brought in property. So it does require leadership. Now, here's one of the questions. Why don't we have this leadership sometimes in our countries? Well, maybe every country needs its time in every era. But I want to venture one hypothesis. And one of those hypotheses is because the advantage that they had then is that they had nobody to teach them. We Latin Americans have people to teach us. So we want to know something, and somebody contradicts me in Peru, I say, look, fella, you can't tell me that because this professor in Harvard says something different. And if somebody says something different from someone else, I pick up a book and I quote another professor from Chicago, and I say, you can't say that because he said this. But you see, that's a disadvantage because it stops you thinking for yourself. The guys who understood liberation as a process of democratizing rights that we're Americans are all dead. Existing Americans, their fathers, are not interesting. It's their great-great-granddaddies who knew what you had to do. And they destroyed basic inequality, and they destroyed essentially feudalism and patrimonialism. Karl Popper, a great philosopher, had something about this. He remembered going to see a concert by Karl Busch, who was then a famous violinist. And a friend asked him to take him there because he said this is the world's greatest violinist. And in effect, I forget what he was interpreting, but let's say it was Mozart. And as he passed from the third to the fourth movement, it was really of such virtue, a virtuoso movement, that both Karl Popper and his friend were moved to tears. And they went to visit him at his lodge afterwards to congratulate. And they said, Maestro, how did you move? How did you do that? And he said, you know, I'm an old man. I don't mind giving you my secrets. So he put his violin to his neck, and he took his fiddlestick, and he's never been able to play the third to the fourth movement again. Let me give you another story, which will clarify the first one. There was a centipede and a spider. And the spider tells a centipede, how do you get organized? It's incredible. I have 8 legs and I'm in confusion. You have 100 legs and you manage to get organized. And the centipede says, look, it's very simple. You have to lift the first 20 on the right, and the centipede has never been able to move. What I'm basically trying to tell you is that when a society does everything correctly in different stages, by the time you get to the 5th generation, nobody remembers, and they don't care. So what we have to strive for, and we are alone in our task, we don't have the World Bank with us, we don't have any international organization with us, we don't have developed countries with us, is to remember what the genesis is like. What happens when you have a massive amount of poor and a very small amount of rich people and a medium class that's still not sizable enough? What did developed countries have to do? And that is the reply to leadership. And it means, among other things, that you become independent, that you think for yourself, that you understand that macroeconomic rules are not enough, that you've got to get in contact with the poor, and that you may want to challenge your own bureaucracy from day A, because they're not going to tell you. Last but not least, that it's a political problem. If you go to all the revolutions in the West, they were not led by specialists. They were led by politicians who had the broad view, because you need the guidance. And you need another thing. You need ideology. There's this general feeling now, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, that the West, that the Cold War is over. But you know, it's a longer war. I think it's very important that we position ourselves. The war we're in is basically a war that's been lasting 400 years. That began with the Enlightenment, when a group of Europeans thought that civilization should be written in singular, not with an S. That we would all be parts of a society because we all, humankind, had certain elements in common. And we did not have to go and say, we're doing this because we're ethnically different, or we're doing this because we're culturally different. And you know, there was immediate opposition to the Enlightenment. And these people were called the Romantic Nationalists, those who believed that no, just like Samuel Huntington, there's something very special about the United States that makes it very different from any other country. Just like Hugo Chavez, there's something in Venezuela that makes us very different from other countries. And that Enlightenment has essentially won the wars against feudalism, and lately it won the war against the Cold War. But it won it in practice. It didn't win it in theory. It isn't that the market economy triumphed over communism. It's that communism collapsed, which is a different conclusion. Because globalization is the extension of the Cold War in a different arena. It is no longer the arena where you have two capitals, Beijing and Moscow, coordinating everything. Now there's no central coordination. But it is still essentially the difference between those who believe in the individual, who believe in the community of mankind versus those who don't and will not accept international lessons. It's also a question about discussing the labor theory of value. All over the world, even though there may not be big communist parties, there's more articles written on the labor theory of value, which says that manpower is the source of all value. And what I've tried to indicate to you by talking about property rights, business organizations, identity, and the rule of law is that the source of value is not only manpower, it's the power of man to change his institutions. And nobody on the liberal side that I know has even come up with an argument against the labor theory of value. And even though people do not elicit it in frank argument, it is what is basically behind every argument that goes against the market economy and every argument that goes against modern society. And with this, therefore, I will end. We must get to the source of things. We must get to the source of law. When we talk about property rights, we must concentrate on the issues of the law, not so much on the issues of computers. You know, in Peru, we've computerized our whole registry system. And it's still working as badly as before because the majority of people are not registered. You know, computers don't create information. There's no such thing as a computer with a vacuum cleaner that sucks in information. Before you can digitalize, you've got to paperize. And before you can paperize, you've got to civilize. And you've got to come to a social contract where you can bring everybody in. So you can't be sidetracked by culture. You can't be sidetracked by information technology. And when ideas come into place, then things happen. Let's just remember what happened when the Berlin Wall fell. There was no B-52s, there was no bombers, there was no troops coming in. Communism collapsed because the idea collapsed. So I'm very glad that you are discussing here ideas, because I think ideas are still the crucial elements with which to obtain development and modernity. Thank you.
Nós temos agora, então, 20 minutos de um debate com o professor Hernando de Soto, que deu uma brilhante palestra a todos vocês. E quais são as reformas que o Brasil deveria fazer para reduzir a informalidade?
Well, I don't need a translation for that. Well, really, what I've been talking about before, let me talk to you about that a little bit. Informality is not a Brazilian problem. It's a universal problem. Informality exists, as we are now finding out, and we're trying to get the numbers, because we don't really have good numbers throughout the world, in the manners which I described. People who don't have the forms or the law to have property, to be good citizens, and to form business organizations, and to have a national and global identity. In the Ukraine, the government calculates that it's 65% of Ukrainians. We just finished a study for President Macapa with 975 people, because you can't pick this off the books, based in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and informality is 98% of the population. In the case of Egypt, it is roughly 92% of buildings and 86% of businesses. And their total value is something like $245 billion, which is equivalent to 40 times all monies received from the World Bank, 90 times all bilateral aid since Napoleon left at the beginning of the 19th century, and it is 35 times bigger than the Cairo Stock Exchange. In the case of Mexico, it is about $315 billion and comprises 11 billion buildings and is 57% of the population. So you've got it from Asia to Latin America to everywhere. What has happened over the last 40 years is that the people that we generally only looked at in National Geographic magazine as very curious people from the old Inca Empire of the Aztecs, the old Inca Empire of the Peruvians, or the Aztecs from Mexico, or the hinterland, have now moved massively to the cities. In average, from Algiers to Rio de Janeiro, 15% of the population has moved in the last 35 years. And all of a sudden, these people are no longer that much in National Geographic magazine or in the Discovery Channel. They're in our cities, and they're surrounding us. And the big wall is essentially a legal wall. But it's a legal wall that you have to get in to find out, because it's not a legal wall at the level of Constitution and the laws, because theoretically the laws are good. But when you get down to practice, in the case of Egypt, it takes 549 days to open a business. But if you want to stay in the business, it will take 40% of your income. And if you want to close a contract with another private sector person, it'll take 20% of your income. And you can't exit it. And those realities are realities that we have left to technicians when they are realities of momentous political proportions. So the issue is to be able to look. It's two things. First of all, I think liberals have to accept that there are social classes. One enormous advantage of Marxists over liberals, one of the few, is that they believe in social classes. There are people who are objectively and subjectively affected in different ways. The advantage of liberals over Marxists is that the liberals attach importance to law. And therefore, they can also understand that law is a system of discrimination, while Marx didn't give much importance to it. But if you can bring both things together to understand that you've at least got two classes in your country, and that the law is the instrument not of exploitation, of discrimination, and that politicians, it has to be on the political agenda, you are on your way to making the issue rise to the level that it deserves so as to be able to be broken the way it was broken in Western countries in the 19th century.
Obrigada, professor. Uma outra pergunta ainda sobre a questão da a grande revolução no sistema de propriedade nos Estados Unidos, no final do século XIX, é devido à atuação do judiciário ou do adverse possession, o uso capião, no Brasil. O seu livro não especifica muito bem sobre este tema.
The reason I don't specify that in the book is because different legal vehicles were used in different countries to be able to deal with issues. If you had a problem, for example, in California at the time of the gold rush, where these Americans had not only taken territory that was not theirs, it belonged to Mexico, but there were many more North American families at gunpoint than there were owners that had legitimate title. And there was no way that you were going to take them out in the same way that there's no way that you're going to take out the squatters of Cairo or the favelas of Rio. You have to then find out what is your moment of genesis. How are you going to settle this once and for all so that everybody from here on only uses the law to be able to deal an issue with property? Now, common law countries, of course, have the advantage that in the case, for example, of the United Kingdom and many British-type civilizations, is that the development of the law goes through the courts. So it's a very gradual process, which is another reason why Anglo-Saxons can teach you very little about the genesis of property, because it took such a long time. And it took 300 years, and nobody really wrote it up in a manner that would be interesting for countries like ours. But even in the United States, they used a variety of different systems. As a matter of fact, they used 32 systems. Throughout the 19th century, they created 32 different systems that were not of common law, but that were actually based on different legal precedents. It doesn't really matter how. The important thing is the following one. It's to make sure that it becomes primarily a political issue instead of a legal issue. You see, if you decide to work strictly through the law and you decide to look at who has title to what today, you of course are not going to be able to understand the ground, because on paper everything overlaps everything else. Everything's in conflict. But when you visit the place that's in conflict, there is no conflict. Either the narcotraficantes are running it, favela leaders are running it, or the law is running it. You have to deal first of all with political realities. And when you've got political realities, then you can go to the law and find out which is the best way that you can achieve peace through law. But the order in which you do things is crucial. It is useless to rely on a legal system that only has created greater divisions in our society than those that it has solved.
Professor, a pergunta agora diz que, numa entrevista que o senhor concedeu ao jornal Zero Hora, publicada domingo, o senhor declara, abre aspas, a informalidade e a burocracia são barreiras gigantes ao desenvolvimento das nações, sendo que a maioria das posses dos países em desenvolvimento não está registrada no papel. Em contrapartida, o senhor defende que as economias ricas somente cresceram quando facilitaram o registro de propriedade e as transações empresariais. A pergunta é a seguinte: qual a alternativa que o senhor sugere ao Brasil para minimizar os entraves e os empecilhos ao desenvolvimento, tendo em vista que cerca de 50% dos imóveis urbanos estão na informalidade, ou seja, não matriculados, e 2/3 dos imóveis rurais estão irregulares. E ainda, para que se evitem confusões no entendimento de alguns conceitos, pergunta também se a responsabilidade pela informalidade e pela burocracia podem ser atribuídas aos aplicadores do direito, por exemplo, aos registradores da propriedade ou à própria legislação, ou ainda se existem outros fatores para isto.
Yes, first of all, of course, when one has an interview over the phone and one doesn't check its facts, I'd like to correct a slight distortion probably that I originated. Bureaucracies basically apply the law. So I don't think that bureaucracies are primarily responsible for anything. I think it's essentially a political responsibility because the laws are made by politicians and the rules are made by politicians. In my country, for example, we have tried to find out how many rules and laws the executive branch of government in Peru makes per year since 1945 until today. And the number comes out 28,000 rules per year. That is to say about 110 per day. With that vomit of rules, it's very difficult for any bureaucracy to do anything right. And what is missing are essentially a series of things that require political order. First of all, you need statistics. Everybody complains about government not being as efficient as you would like it in a developing country, but it's a complaint. It isn't really a formulation of stuff. You have to get numbers to find out how many people are actually prejudiced by law. You see, all laws respond to somebody with influence being able to bring out not necessarily dishonest law, but a law that favors what they think is good for society. So there's an intensity in that law and a defense which is very hard to beat. But if you're able to bring out statistics, but I mean real hard statistics in Brazil, whereby you determine how many people are really in it, it would be very interesting. I remember a few years ago a very brief trip to Rio de Janeiro, and I asked, since I was being toured the city, they started talking to me about favelas, and I said, that's very interesting, how many favelas they are. I said, oh, well, we don't have the problem Peru has. I forget what the number was, but you know, something like 35% are favelas, or 40%, I forget the figure. I said, that's interesting. Then we came to another part of the city, and I said, what favela is that? And they said, that's not a favela. That's a village that is run by drug traffickers. I said, how many are there? So they said, maybe 10, 15%, 20%. I said, that's very interesting. Then we went to another part of the city, and then we found that there was another thing which to me looked pretty illegal, and I said, what's that? And they said, that's a subdivision, an illegal subdivision of territory, but it's not a favela. Well, in my book, I had already Rio into 70%. So you've got to get the right definitions and find out who's on either side of the law. What does that do for you? It creates a constituency for change. Because if you're going to beat bad laws, you've got to get, like in the United States, like in Canada, like in Western Europe, a constituency for good laws. You know, one of the things we always forget, and that these Europeans never tell us, is how the European economic community is being formed. Spain, for example, up until 1978, before it joined the European Union, had the same GNP per capita as Argentina. And now it's 4 times the GNP per capita. What did Spain do? Did it receive a lot of money for bridges? Did it set up nuclear plants? Did it set up a new airport? Well, what did it do? It essentially received groups of technocrats from all of the rest of Europe to essentially make Spanish law compatible with the market economy laws of other European countries. Over 300 technicians worked for over 15 years to make one system of laws compatible with the other. And in the process, it obtained good property rights, it obtained good business entrances, etc. And in the process, it was able to justify in front of parliaments, year after year, how many Spaniards would not be able to compete if the laws weren't modified. In other words, by the time the change came about, there were huge constituencies for change. So you've got to identify your constituency. And when you identify your constituency, you are then in a position to beat back privileged interests, which may only defend unknowingly, innocently, a very small part of all interests together. That's the first thing, those are the 2 first things that have to be taken place. And then from those statistics, from that new way of photographing reality through law, through obligations, and through rights, you will be able to set an agenda which will be very particularly Brazilian, and you will know where to go next.
Então vamos, lamentavelmente, para a última pergunta, professor. O senhor não acha que o crescimento de líderes social-comunistas, diz o indagante, na América Latina, como Chávez e Evo Morales, mostra que estamos distantes demais de um verdadeiro capitalismo? E eu acrescento com uma outra pergunta aqui, que estamos caminhando mais para caudilhos na liderança do que verdadeiros líderes.
Well, you know, if you, during 15 years, start macroeconomic reforms of the Washington consensus style, which, according to Williamson, has 10 points: fiscal stability, privatization, opening up of trade, etc. But you don't follow the last two, which are access to enterprise and property rights. What you've done is you've created a good playing field for the few who know how to get at rights, who already have property and who already have enterprises, and you left out the majorities. So what has happened in countries like the Andean countries like Venezuela, Bolivia, and will maybe happen in the case of Peru, where we're about to go for elections, is that a majority of the country went with a certain illusion towards the opening of markets when communism collapsed. And then, of course, when it didn't bring them concrete results, they go against those who speak loudest against the prevailing system. It's not really complicated. The important thing is that to win an election, you have to be anti-establishment. So there is no surprise, as far as I'm concerned, in Venezuela and Bolivia and Peru. These are countries where the market has not served everybody well. But I repeat, it has not served everybody well, not because Incas are not entrepreneurs. They're all over the place. They're in the streets. They're building houses. They're like the favelas. They're some of the most entrepreneurial class in the world. They're willing, if they're unhappy in Lima, to migrate to the United States, to cross the Rio Grande. Very powerful people from Mexico down to Peru. And Mexico will probably elect a very leftist leader before. If the market economy does not help everybody and does not have a policy to help everybody the way it did in Europe and in North America in the 19th century, that's called mercantilism. That's capitalism for a few. Marx pointed it out very well before, that capitalism's contradiction was the concentration of capital and wealth in just a few. The reason that North America has survived against this very good analysis, and Europe has survived, is because the Europeans and the Americans, even through civil wars and 2 world wars, finally ended up making it pretty accessible to everybody. Latin Americans are not the only ones in this problem, and it's not only us that are haunted by the ghosts of Marx. China is too. You've got 1,300,000,000 people in China, and mark my words, those in the East Coast are about 250 million. They've got property rights, and they've got businesses. Otherwise, you couldn't transact with them. Obviously, they do. And they've got international identity, or you wouldn't be able to get their shipments on boats and on airplanes, and you wouldn't be able to ship money to them. But over 1 billion do not. And according to the Chinese government, not according to their opponents, according to the Chinese government, there were 85,000 revolts in China in 2005, mostly caused through what Marx would have called alienation, a sense of only a few being able and the majority not being able. Capitalism will collapse in any country where the majority sees things going for the few. The reply to this is either those who believe in markets become very social, and the tradition in many countries, at least in my country, Peru, is that those who know about markets don't care about the poor, or the left becomes sensitive to markets, because in my country the tradition is, on the left, that they care about the poor but they don't believe in markets. And so when we get rid of that contradiction, we will finally become modern countries. So it has very much to do with ideology. Don't let anybody think that the world of ideology and the wars of ideology is over. It's just begun.
Caro professor Hernando de Soto, em nome do Instituto de Estudos Empresariais, o IEE, patrocinador de mais este 19º Fórum da Liberdade, passo às mãos de Vossa Senhoria este diploma pela sua participação. Ao agradecer ao professor Hernando de Soto pela brilhante contribuição a este fórum, eu quero informar a todos os senhores que nós teremos em seguida o painel, o terceiro painel, que vai discutir o poder no Brasil, quais os direitos e os deveres dos governos.